My name is Dana Fisher. I'm a Duty Council staff lawyer for Legal Aid Ontario and here today as a spokesperson for the union representing Legal Aid Ontario lawyers with the Society of United Professionals. I'll be speaking first and then I'll be introducing my co-panelists. In justification of and in response to intense public outrage over the unprecedented and cruel cuts to Legal Aid Ontario, Premier Doug Ford and Attorney General Caroline Mulroney have claimed that Legal Aid Ontario is representing 10% fewer clients now than in 2013-14. They claim that this is why their cuts to Legal Aid Ontario should be of little consequence to those in need of legal aid. We can find no evidence to support this, despite having combed through Legal Aid Ontario's annual and quarterly reports and the recent Auditor General's report, all of which detail all of the services and representation provided by Legal Aid Ontario. Those reports, in fact, document that there is an increase in Legal Aid Ontario's clients and not a decrease. Attorney General Caroline Mulroney first wrote that Legal Aid Ontario served 10% fewer clients in her April the 12th letter to Legal Aid Ontario. Doug Ford has since repeated this inaccuracy, including most recently to radio listeners this past Monday, April the 22nd. This claim is not true. The truth is that Legal Aid Ontario is providing representation for more clients and not less. Whether or not Doug Ford knows that this statement is inaccurate, he has misled Ontarians. We are calling on Doug Ford and Caroline Mulroney to reverse the cuts, the devastating cuts to Legal Aid Ontario. We are calling on all concerned citizens and Ontarians to send their own message to Doug Ford and Caroline Mulroney through the website stoplegalaidcuts.ca. The proof that Legal Aid Ontario is providing more service is in the Auditor General's December 2018 report. Legal Aid Ontario issues legal aid certificates to clients who qualify. Each legal aid certificate is a voucher to be provided to a private lawyer in exchange for legal representation. From 2013-14 to 2017-18, the Auditor General found a 23% increase in the number of certificates issued by Legal Aid Ontario. That is indisputably more clients represented and not less. Duty Council, who are lawyers like me, provide the highest volume of representation. According to the Auditor General's numbers, we provided service and representation to 13,000 more people per year in 2017-18 than in 2013-2014. Again, clearly more clients represented and not less. The only indication of any purported drop in services are easily explained by accounting practices and improvements to service models that one would expect the Attorney General to not only be aware of, but to support and advocate for more such cost-saving and streamlining of services by Legal Aid Ontario. For example, Legal Aid Ontario initiated a program in 2014 to have non-lawyers assist with aspects of files that do not require a licensed lawyer. Legal Aid Ontario temporarily tracked the services of the Legal Aid Ontario court workers as part of the assessment of the cost effectiveness of the program. Once that program was deemed successful, those statistics were removed from public tracking in order to place the focus of public reporting squarely on legal representation. If Ford and Mulroney were counting those numbers, that would be a gross misrepresentation of the services provided. Legal Aid Ontario also operates a 1-800 number. This is for members of the public to call in for legal information and summary legal advice, and to apply for legal aid certificates for representation. This week, Doug Ford called in to Alan Carter's show, AM 640, and Ford told anyone who needs legal aid services to call him. He guaranteed them that he will get them legal aid. Last year, Legal Aid Ontario received an average of more than 1,000 phone calls for each working day of the year, which is actually an increase of 13.6% since 2013-14. If the public is taking him up on his offer, I suspect that the Premier is learning a little bit about how busy legal aid actually is. All the evidence shows that more Ontarians are receiving more legal aid service and not less. Again, we could find no evidence to support the Premier's and the Attorney General's claim that there are fewer legal aid clients. Instead, the Auditor General's numbers show that legal aid services have increased over the time frame that was given by the government. If Doug Ford truly wants to guarantee legal aid to anyone who needs it, he should be increasing the funding and not decreasing it. We know through the changes to legal eligibility that there are many more vulnerable people in desperate need of legal aid who don't receive it even before the cuts were made. These are Indigenous and racialized people, people suffering from mental health issues, individuals who will lose their housing, education, or employment opportunities, could lose their children and have their safety jeopardized. Since the budget was released, much of the focus has been on the refusal of the province to permit Legal Aid Ontario to use any funds other than federal funds for immigration and refugee law. And while we vehemently disagree with the directive and the resultant cuts to refugee and immigration legal services, that accounts for less than 1/4 of the total cut Doug Ford is imposing on Legal Aid Ontario. Inevitably, with 30% less provincial funding, fewer people will receive legal aid representation through certificates, through through clinics, and through the many other services provided by Legal Aid Ontario. And those who do receive it will receive it most likely in a more limited capacity that will not fully address their legal needs and their jeopardy. Many of the people who will be denied representation are quite literally fighting for their lives, for the lives and safety of their children, and for their liberty. To offer perspective on the various parts of the legal aid system, including current service levels and how clients will be impacted by Ford's government's cuts, I'm joined by 3 panelists, and I thank them for joining me today. We have first Ivana Petriconi. She's Policy Counsel with the Association of Community Legal Clinics. Next will be speaking Raul Bulakia, member of the executive with the Refugee Lawyers Association. And to close us off, we have Katrina Yankcheruk, Vice President of the Ontario Association of Child Protection Lawyers, Toronto chapter.
Thank you, Dana. So as Dana said, I'm Policy Counsel at the Association of Community Legal Clinics. Our association is the voice of the legal clinics throughout Ontario. I'll just speak a little bit about the work that clinics do. Our clinics are funded by Legal Aid Ontario to provide what the law calls clinic law services. We tend to call it poverty law services because it's the type of service, legal services that people need because they have low incomes, because they are poor. So generally that means housing law, it can be social assistance law, but many other things as well. So we like to say we help people keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. I wanted to elaborate a little bit on the clinic statistics that we've seen sent around in various formats. I need to emphasize that when you look at the number of files that clinics have handled, the numbers have gone up steadily every year. We have had increases throughout. And we have had those increases, we continue to have those increases, except that when you look at the charts, it seems like we've had a serious reduction in numbers in 2017-18. What happened in 2017-18 was not that we served fewer people or we did less work or we took longer to do that work. What happened in 2017-18 was the counting system was changed. So Legal Aid Ontario gave clinics a different system for counting. That meant that we were now comparing literally apples to oranges, whereas before, so let me say that clinics do a number of different legal services. We provide what might be thought of as the traditional representation where we go to court or a tribunal on behalf of a client, and that's one type of service that we provide. We also provide advice to individuals that might take a short period of time. We have brief services which might involve writing a letter or making a call to a landlord or trying to stop an eviction in a quick way, and we used to call those brief services. We also do a great deal of public legal education to talk to communities and talk to our clients about their rights. And we also do quite a bit of policy advocacy when we see that there are systemic issues that need to be addressed for our clients and the communities that we serve, and we address them. We come often to this building to make representations to policymakers and lawmakers about how the laws and policies will impact on the people that we serve. So we provide all of those services. We used to count all of those services, and so we got to 240,000 a year. Now we count the cases that are opened. So that is the reduction that is seen in the numbers. Not that we're doing less work, but that the numbers are being counted differently. I want to touch a little bit on what these cuts will mean for community legal clinics and our clients. Community legal clinics serve the most vulnerable among us. I would say almost all of our clients are people with disabilities. We don't always handle their disability issues, but they are almost always people with disabilities because that's the face of poor people in Ontario. And so if we're not there to help with the housing issues, if we're not there to help with the income support, people will be homeless. We have a clinic that is specialized in providing services to children and youth. A lot of the kids that they look after are kids who are street kids. And without their help, they become homeless. They end up on the streets. Our offices are community offices, so there's clinics all over the province in communities throughout Ontario. And we have small offices. We are funded in such a way that there is no fat. Almost everybody who works in a clinic sees a client, provides direct services. Virtually everybody who works in a clinic. So all of our funding, 95% of our funding goes to the salaries of those people who provide services. We don't have fat. We don't have places where we can, stop doing something that is a bit expensive and not have an impact on our clients. So any cut to clinics, let alone a 30% cut, any cut more than a couple of $1 million rather, will mean a reduction in the services. It will mean we have to lay off workers in clinics. Everyone that has spoken so far from the provincial government has talked about there being no reduction in services. We can't do that in clinics if our budgets are cut. And we've been told by Legal Aid Ontario that clinics will share in the pain. To us, that means that we will have our budgets cut and then our services will be reduced. So I think that's everything for me.
The cancellation of most services for immigrants and refugees was immediate and it was devastating. It has put the lives of immigrants and refugees at risk. Immigrants and refugees now cannot get legal aid to represent them in hearings, to represent them in litigation. They will face deportation because of that. For refugees, they're pleading that they're at risk of torture, of death. They're now exposed to deportation, to torture or death without even being able to have a lawyer to represent them. Immigrants can be people, when they're facing deportation, who have lived in Ontario for very long. Sometimes they're people who've lived most of their lives in Ontario. They have roots, they have families. Now they don't even get a fair chance. The argument that the province has made that they just want more federal funding or that they want the federal government to pay for all this cost has been taken out on innocent people. If a province wants to demand more funding, they could do it responsibly instead of hurting people who are utterly vulnerable and using the pain that those people are suffering as some kind of bargaining chip. The argument is also not clearly rooted in constitutional law. Legal Aid Ontario has its roots in lawyers organizing legal aid, in the Law Society governing legal aid, and then the Ontario government taking over legal aid. The reason is that the constitutional power over governance of the professions is provincial, not federal. The practical argument that the federal government can and should contribute money and could contribute more because although immigration law is a shared jurisdiction between federal and provincial governments, in practical terms, the federal government has occupied the field and has passed legislation, runs its tribunals. That's an argument that the federal government tacitly agreed to for years, and they've been contributing. If the province wants a bigger share to be paid by the federal government, that could be solved in a responsible way without hurting people. And we'd be glad to play any role we can in those discussions. But ruining people's lives, when charter rights are at stake, international human rights law rights are at stake, families are being torn apart, communities are being affected, and these are communities that are part of Ontario. And these are people who, when they settle in Ontario or when they can remain in Ontario, will be a productive part of our society. It's simply wrong. There are a lot of immigrants, immigrant families, people with relatives who are affected, who had absolutely no idea whatsoever that this was coming. They believed that when they're told that the government is for the people, that they are also people. And what's been done to them is just completely irresponsible. It's devastating. We ask that the funding be restored, that Ontario recognize it does have a role in this and a responsibility, and that any negotiations or conflict resolution between the province and the federal government should be done responsibly, not by hurting people and then say, look how much for hurting, why don't you pay up? That's not how to govern. That's how other groups behave. It's not how a government behaves.
My name's Katrina Yancherek, and I'm a family law lawyer and child protection lawyer in the city of Toronto, and I'm here today on behalf of the Ontario Association of Child Protection Lawyers. I'm here to support the organizations that are represented at the table and also to put in my own piece about child protection law in particular. The association did provide a press release dated April 12th, and I brought copies today of that if anyone's interested in that. I wanted to point out that child protection is an area of law that's often overlooked, and I would even suggest marginalized in relation to other areas of law. I think that's largely because the people that are represented are from marginalized communities, including individuals with mental health issues, low-income individuals, or people from racialized or Indigenous communities. Our association recently intervened in a child protection case in which the Ontario Court of Appeal had noted that in adjudicating child protection cases, the courts needed to be especially mindful of the reality and material circumstances of those subject to the child protection proceedings. The court acknowledged that women, and especially single mothers, are disproportionately represented in child protection proceedings. Poverty and other forms of marginalization form part of the experience of many parents involved in child protection proceedings. This is an area of law that has been also subject to chronic underfunding in various areas, and that's not just my opinion. I refer you to the report of the Mother Risk Commission, where several recommendations were made to improve funding to legal aid to ensure that there is adequate funding to avoid the miscarriages of justice that were identified by Justice Lang in the Mother Risk report. The cuts mean that none of those recommendations will be followed in an already underfunded area of law. Our association is concerned with the impact the cuts will have on families. Cuts to legal aid are a false economy. The cuts will inevitably lead to other expenditures or pressures on Ontario in the future, notably in the areas of mental health, emotional and physical health and functioning, and all of the related impact on education, housing, the sustainability of a viable workforce. We're asking that the Ontario government recognize the funding, the importance of funding and legal aid, and particularly in child protection, given the complexity, the vulnerability of the population regularly involved, and the charter rights that are regularly invoked. Lawyers in family law and child protection, it's been my experience, have sought at times and enjoyed productive relationships with government and with legal aid, looking at ways to deliver legal aid in a way that serves the clients. To suggest otherwise, or to suggest that lawyers are getting rich doing legal aid, is an affront to those many lawyers working hard every day to ensure that their clients can navigate a confusing and overwhelming legal system where the stakes are very high, namely losing your children. We welcome any opportunity to engage or continue a dialogue with government and legal aid, while at the same time ensuring that funding is restored and the cuts are stopped. Thank you.
Do you have any idea where the Attorney General is getting her numbers?
Absolutely none, no. Neither the Premier nor the Attorney General have shown us any of their work, so it's really difficult to pinpoint where they're getting their numbers. As indicated, we had a statistician and our staff from the Society of United Professionals who went through all the annual reports, all the quarterly reports, and the Auditor General's report in particular, and can find no basis for those numbers, aside from, again, the counting changes that we've noted and the changes in the practices that we're actually streamlining of services and improving of statistics. So,
and just a technical follow-up, just these numbers in the chart on the front of this,
Yes.
do these represent the number of individuals served?
I'm going to double check because I don't have that chart in front of me. Yes, they do, I'm being told. Yes, the client's represented. Yes, thank you.
So is it possible then the government is taking the issue of the accounting change and the other thing that was mentioned about non-lawyers providing services, that's where they get their number from? They're taking those things?
We honestly don't know. I mean, that's a speculation that we're kind of putting out there that could potentially be. I'm going to let...
Is that up to 100,000 people? That's what they say, 100,000 people.
Yes.
Yeah.
It does, yeah. Those two
Okay.
numbers combined, so the non-lawyer services that were being provided to streamline services, which again are still occurring, but are just no longer being counted. So it's not that those services have diminished. And then as Katrina, who I think, sorry, not Katrina, Ivana, my apologies, is going to add in there about the clinic piece as well. The Auditor General in their actual report has an explanatory note, and I think that's in the materials that you're looking at there. So there is quite clearly not fewer services being provided by the clinics, and I'll let her speak to that as well, as she has.
Right. Well, as I said, there are not fewer services being provided, but I did want to address the which I didn't say in my remarks, but clinics are staffed not only by staff lawyers. Services and clinics are provided by a number of roles. There are lawyers, of course, because some of the work needs to be done by lawyers, but we have paralegals, there are licensed paralegals, we have community legal workers. Traditionally, from the start of the clinic system, we've had community legal workers who are not lawyers providing legal services. So some of they go to tribunals where a lawyer doesn't have to appear. So we do, these numbers include lawyers and non-lawyers providing services.
And just really quickly, I would also add to that if those are the numbers that they're relying upon, the ease with which those can be determined to not actually be a loss in services is kind of shocking to come from the Attorney General and the Premier. And if that is the basis, which they've claimed that it is, for the cut to the services, then we would call upon them to reinstate rather the funding to legal aid. Thank you.
Could you speak to, or Katerina said earlier that this is penny wise, pound foolish, because a cut to legal aid now may lead to more expense for the justice system down the road, or social services down the road. I just wonder if you could speak to that, like what, I mean, I don't know if you guys have done any modeling to see how much more expensive it would be to have more people in jail, or more people needing mental health services and so on, because they get caught up in the judicial system.
I think the thing that I might refer you to, and which probably gives a more fulsome example of that, is really the Mother Risk Report, and then particularly the Beeman Commission. And so there's a lot of the work of the Commission has been that they were able to talk to a number of people who are affected by the justice system, and talked in particular about how they were affected, how their lives were changed, or their mental health issues, what had occurred in their lives, and they had given those examples, and they're anecdotal, they're not statistical, and based on that, there were recommendations that were very specific, and Beeman was very clear in identifying that there are inadequacies in the funding model, and that some of the miscarriages of justice and the subsequent social cost to the participants might have been avoided. And certainly there hasn't been, from the Beeman Commission's work, I think the statistical approach that you're identifying, but certainly there were a number of participants who identified changes in their lives. They were profoundly impacted by what had occurred.
And given the Premier's comments on the radio on Monday with Alan Carter, does he know what he's talking about when it comes to legal aid?
I think we're going to leave that one to you to figure out.
You guys are the experts. I mean, I mean, he characterized it in a certain way, and apparently people can phone his office and get services now. But.
Well, I'm not sure how he expects that to play out. As we indicated, there's 1,000 calls a day. Welcome everybody to give him a phone call. You know, and that's only the phone calls coming in. That doesn't include the actual representation, the services provided, the clinics, the services that are being provided, the certificates, the duty counsel services when you come into a courtroom and receive services. I'm not sure that, you know, I welcome him to come and visit the court system and see what's happening on the ground. I don't know that he's had that opportunity.
Well, for immigrants and refugees also, the province has directed legal aid that they can't spend any money if it doesn't come from federal government, including the Law Foundation money, which comes from lawyers, not from the province, and any provincial money. And legal aid has clearly defined, you know, that we're not representing anybody in any hearings, period, or any appeals or federal court, period. So people could telephone. For Premier, it's not really possible for him to take 1,000 phone calls a day, but suppose they did, he would have to reverse the order that legal aid was given.
So I just wanted to add in a comment, and I think it relates to the dialogue that's been going on. I think that sometimes there's the perception that legal aid is a free-for-all and that it's just money to grab. And in fact, getting legal aid is, and getting authorization for legal aid is a much more careful process. There's the process in which the individual has to call. They have to qualify financially. Their case has to fit within the specific criteria that is covered by legal aid. And then even within that, in my own experience, for instance, if they are granted a certificate for a family law matter, then it's up to the lawyer to go back to legal aid and say that these are the particular areas within the case that they require authorization for, and they may not necessarily get that authorization. So there's a great deal of scrutiny from the beginning to end. So the idea that you can just pick up the phone and have a conversation with the Premier about that seems to negate the long, intensive process that it takes to get legal aid and then to get authorization for the work that needs to be done under legal aid. It's a very careful process, and just echoing the comments of some of my colleagues, that's where a lot of the cost savings come in, because nobody's going to ask for authorization to do something that is unreasonable, and there's a lot of scrutiny along the way, not just by legal aid, but by the lawyer who's actually doing the work and assessing constantly, is this a step that's necessary to take? How can I do it in a more effective way?
And the same is true for clinics. Absolutely, we couldn't we couldn't act for all the people who call us and need our services. So we have financial eligibility criteria, we have case selection criteria. So there is a process to determine if a person who calls is eligible. So I don't know how you would deliver those services by a simple phone call to the. I mean, we could try. We've suggested at the office where I work that maybe, we should post the phone number, but we'll.
Can I, sorry, I wanted a question about the Auditor General's report. So it did identify a bunch of problems, financial controls with legal aid. Well, Rooney mentions the lawyer who billed 150 grand, and we don't quite know why or what for. Are there not issues that need to be addressed with the way legal aid's run?
I'm going to say that I'm sure there are some issues that need to be addressed. I will say that in terms of the lawyer that you just mentioned was a lawyer that was identified by legal aid in their own audit that that the Auditor General picked up on, and so that this shows that the auditing put out by legal aid actually does discover these issues and does take steps to address them. Yes, in a system that serves, I think it was 400,000, plus people in a year, yes, there are going to be, some areas where there can be some improvements.
Well, there's no way of verifying how long a lawyer spends in court or.
Well, but again, that comes from the very fact that, and this is in the Auditor General's report, talks about a lot of the services or a lot of the recommendations actually center on things that the Attorney General needs to do to improve the court system. So no, you can't track how long a lawyer's in the court, but the Auditor General has suggested that the Attorney General improve the court system so that that is possible to do. So frankly, a number of the recommendations don't actually address issues that legal aid itself needs to address, but actually speak to issues that need to be addressed by the Attorney General.
Right, this may be in the weeds, but also the issue of the thresholds, which have been rising.
Yes.
Each year.
The financial
to try and
thresholds?
get legal aid up to the actual poverty line, that's significantly below the poverty line. So each year, more money comes, threshold goes up. But the Auditor General talks about how a couple of years ago, the number of people getting service did not go up commensurate with the threshold increase. So legal aid changed other criteria and then suddenly had a surge of people that it couldn't deal with and had a deficit. So I mean, is that another sign that the organization, which I know you guys don't run, it does have some shortcomings, has some financial issues that it needs to address?
I could speak to
Perfect,
that.
thank you.
Actually, with the increase in financial eligibility, what legal aid found was that with very incremental increases, because for bit by bit, it's not sudden, they did get an increase in people who qualified. But to not qualify is incredibly easy. And you can have a minimum wage job and not qualify. So the increase has to be a lot more substantial to get a far greater number of people who are qualifying for certificates. So I think that's why they also expanded services to make sure that they were utilizing funds they had.
And the services that were expanded included services to some of the most vulnerable people in Ontario. It included providing legal, and again, it speaks to the fact that there's a need for increased services. You opened up the door slightly to allow, people with mental health illnesses and people who are racialized individuals and indigenous individuals who weren't facing jail but were going to face significant impacts to their lives and lose educational opportunities, lose employment. You open the door just a crack to allow some access to legal aid services for those individuals and who still had to qualify financially. And the floodgates, yes, opened. And I think that actually speaks to the need for increased funding and not to the need to claw back funding.
Can I just talk about the point you asked about verifying time in court? And I think actually there is a process by which that is done, at least from the civil account side. So first of all, in terms of there are audits done from time to time on lawyers' accounts, and those lawyers are required to submit the docket sheet or the endorsement from the court indicating where they were and for what purpose. For what purpose is significant because it determines the calculation of the tariff. Then the tariff itself, when we're talking about the tariff, we're not talking necessarily about the hourly rate, but we're also talking about the allotment. So in civil law, there's a basic allotment, for instance, a family law matter, 12 hours. And good luck if you can get that done, a family law case done in 12 hours. If you get it done, power to you. But generally, then you'll have to ask for permission for additional allotment. So at that point, you're having to explain to the area director what you were doing with your time. And if your explanation is, I was sitting in court, that's not going to get you the additional authorization. They're quite strict about that.
And sorry, I have one more technical question just about refugees. So my understanding was there was a memo that went out that said, due to this sudden funding change, Legal Aid will still provide the basic form or something like that's called, where that's the first kind of the telling of the story of the refugee claimant. But then, so that service is still being provided, but once you have to appear before a tribunal, you're out of luck. Is that how?
Yeah, exactly. So the only thing that we're funding is that the refugee claimant has to be interviewed and write a detailed statement in this basis of claim form that initiates the refugee claim. That's it. Everything else, you need a medical report because you were tortured, you need a psychiatric report because you're traumatized, you need to prepare proof to try to prepare for your case or win it, you need to have a lawyer in the hearing, you were rejected, you need to appeal, you're being deported, you need to try to get a stay of deportation, and anything for any kind of immigrant. So say you came here when you were 12 years old, you're 57 years old, now you're being deported, absolutely nothing for you. So basically, the only thing that we're funding is completing the form to start the refugee process, nothing for immigrants, nothing for refugees in a hearing or when they're facing deportation. The Supreme Court decided in Singh that for refugee hearing engages the right to security of a person. So the province is violating the Charter of Rights by doing this, and the province is responsible for administering legal aid. It's also decided in Charkawi, the Supreme Court, that detention engages charter rights. So when an immigrant is facing detention and deportation, that can also engage the charter. And the government is violating the charter by refusing to offer those services. So it's very severe, and everyone was really blindsided by it being retroactive. Basically it came out in April. It's the budget for April 1st, 2019 to March 31st, 2020, and it's just ruining lives.
Would be a charter challenge, you think?
I think there's going to have to be.
Nothing filed yet.
Nothing yet.
How hopeful are any of you that the feds will actually step up and provide the extra funding?
Well, right now, the people are caught in the middle, with the province taking its political stance and the federal government simply saying that the province has been irresponsible. And we've seen, for example, you can think of First Nations children on reserves who weren't able to get clean drinking water, and they just kept suffering. So this kind of political posturing and treating people as hostages in what's similar to like a ransom demand, it hurts people, and it can keep hurting people, and the politicians can cry crocodile tears and say it's the other guy's fault. The reality is that if you don't want to hurt people, you provide the service, you're responsible for it. Like if you're a custodial parent, you don't starve your children and let them die because you think that your ex-husband is not sending you enough money. You provide the service and find a way that's responsible to demand whatever it is you want.
Just adding to that, the federal funding will, if it were to come, would assist with the refugee and immigration services, which would be a lifesaver to many people, but it still doesn't address the rest of the cuts that the Premier and the Attorney General have imposed on Legal Aid Ontario. And those are cuts that are going to affect the clinic and the poverty law services and the families and the children that are accessing the family law services that have been described by the people at the table here today, as well as the life and liberty of individuals facing criminal charges.
Yeah, and on that point, I would also add that, as a global strategy, legal aid just needs more funding. It's underfunded. The needs are vast. There are a lot of people who can't really pay a lawyer, and they'll never qualify for legal aid because their earnings are just marginally above these low cutoffs. So, what legal aid could really use is more allies, for the province to give more funding, for federal government to give more funding for everything. And the strategy of saying, well, we're going to cut it off for immigration and refugee law, which is a fraction of the whole budget and really a small amount, and never mind everything else, it doesn't actually serve legal aid very well. I mean, it would be better if the federal government gave more money globally for all legal aid. And that's not about posturing or about the blame game. It's just about caring about people and trying to make society work better. All hands on deck, and let's try to find solutions.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.